Today we come to our final conversation on the buddy bench. It's been a long series and we've covered a lot of women in Scripture, but we certainly haven't covered all of them. We could keep going into Acts and look at more, but we're going to wrap it up today. We're actually not having a conversation with the woman sitting on the bench. I want to spend some time today telling you about her. If you remember our very first sermon in this series, you probably don't, but I described the buddy bench as a seat in the playground where if you see someone sitting alone, you're supposed to go over and talk to them or invite them to come and play with you. Now, I don't know what your school was like, but despite the best efforts of all the administrators and staff and parents and responsible adults, in my small Christian school, there was always at least one kid, maybe two or three, that my friends would never sit with. We wouldn't want to be seen sitting with that person. Perhaps they smelled funny or, I don't know, dressed unusually, or sometimes there were stories that somebody had seen them do this or do that, or they said something funny or strange, and so we just kind of stayed away from them. And so maybe your school was like that. Maybe you were the person people stayed away from. And so I think that dynamic exists in many, many different settings. Throughout church history, Mary Magdalene has been that woman. Mary Magdalene has been the woman that everyone whispers about. There was something strange about her. In fact, in Luke chapter 8 and verse 2, we're told there that she had 7 demons in her. That's all we're told. We don't know what they did to her, but she had 7. But you've got to imagine that having 7 demons in you would make you strange in some way. That's different from most people. Well, about the year 600, so after Jesus, we've moved forward in history 600 years, Pope Gregory the Great, he made the not so great connection that Mary's 7 demons signified the 7 deadly sins. Those deadly sins are completely manufactured or invented by the church of the day. They're certainly not laid out that way in Scripture. But really, Pope Gregory, beyond making this connection of the number, he seems to have confused a couple of different events in the Bible. And I've put up here on the screen, you can see this table. First of all, in Luke chapter 7, we find the story we talked about last week, in fact, where a nameless woman washes Jesus' feet with her tears, dries them with her hair, and anoints them with oil. Now, in the next chapter, so very close to it, we're then introduced to Mary Magdalene. But there's no indication that she's appeared in the gospel previously. In fact, it seems that she's being introduced in chapter 8, rather than somebody who was already there in chapter 7. Then, over in John chapter 12, this is just before Jesus' death. In fact, on the Saturday before, really yesterday in our time frame, the Saturday before Palm Sunday, there's another meal that is given in Bethany, the town of Bethany outside Jerusalem. It's given in Jesus' honor at the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, a brother and sisters. at this meal, Mary, who's known to everyone, she's Mary of Bethany, she's the sister of Lazarus and Martha, she takes perfume, she pours it on Jesus' feet and wipes it with her hair. So there's a couple of similarities between Mary of Bethany and the nameless woman in Luke chapter 7, who is described as a sinner, a sinful person. Now, both stories involve feet, perfume, and hair, but they're in different places, they're at different times, and the Mary in John 12 is clearly identified as not Mary Magdalene. And so you can see at the bottom of the screen here this kind of logic that resulted in Mary Magdalene being labeled a prostitute. There's a sinful woman, there's feet, there's perfume, there's hair. Hey, there's Mary Magdalene. Oh, and Mary of Bethany. And so if we put them all in a blender, we sort of mix it up, out pops a sinful woman named Mary, who must be Mary of Magdalene, with her 7 demons, which 7 demons must make you make her sin sexual in nature, and the worst type of sexual sin is prostitution. Therefore, Mary Magdalene must be a prostitute. Yes, that logic's hard to follow, isn't it? But never mind the fact that most demons in the Gospels seem to negatively impact a person's physical and mental health, not lead them into a lifestyle of sin. But that's not the only rumor going around the playground of history about Mary Magdalene. There's one early, we'll call it gospel, a Gnostic writing by a sort of a heretical branch of Christianity, of the early church, that went off into some strange things. And quite a bit of their writings have been preserved. And so there's this one book that they wrote, and it described, it was rejected by the church, but it claimed that Mary Magdalene married Jesus. This idea was picked up by the author Dan Brown and became both a best-selling book and a movie that you might have heard of called The Da Vinci Code. The idea being that the church had hidden the fact that Jesus, over the centuries, has hidden the fact that Jesus was married and even had children because they wanted to keep the church male-dominated. That was the claim by the Da Vinci Code. Finally, another rumor going around is not that they were married, but in the 1970s musical Jesus Christ Superstar, Mary Magdalene there falls in love with Jesus and sings one of the hit songs of the show, I Don't Know How to Love Him. And so, as often happens in the playground, no one actually takes the time to get to know the real Mary. And they stay away from her because of all these rumors. Something must be wrong with her. There must be some measure of truth. Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? As we see Mary sitting over there on our buddy bench this morning, I want us to consider 4 things that we can know about her. Not rumors, but things that Scripture actually tells us. The first one, and the first 2 we talked about last week and won't spend a lot of time on today. But the first one is that following Jesus, after Jesus removed the demons from her, Mary became a disciple of Jesus. She literally followed Jesus as he traveled and walked around Galilee. The second thing that we know about her is that Mary was a financial patron of Jesus and the disciples. She had enough wealth to be able to contribute, along with other women, to Jesus so that he would have the means to support himself, to give charity to people, whatever their needs were. I think it's significant to point out here that we don't know the age of Mary Magdalene. If we were to go back through art over the centuries, Christian art, we would see that she's often portrayed provocatively, sexually, certainly as a younger person, but she may well have been an older woman, perhaps a widow that had her husband's wealth that she was able to then use to support Jesus and his disciples. And perhaps the respect that we'll see for her later may well be as a consequence of her age and her wisdom that she demonstrated in her time with the disciples. That's a guess. But she had accumulated the wealth somehow, and probably not from, certainly not from prostitution, probably not from her own business, but from marriage or from her family, inheritance, dowry sort of thing, would be where she would have access to money. So they're the two things. The first two, as I say, we mostly talked about those last week. She was a disciple, a follower of Jesus, and that she was a patron, a financial benefactor of Jesus. The third thing is that Mary was one of the female leaders among Jesus' disciples. We know this because she's mentioned by name in every gospel, in each of the gospels, and is often the first woman mentioned in a list of women. So, for instance, in Matthew 28 and verse 1, there we see her referred to as Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. So how would you like to be the other Mary, right? Mary Magdalene clearly was more well known, I suppose, within that the circle of people who were going to be reading that gospel. So she seems to be a leader because of the way that she is written about. And then a fourth thing is that she was a key eyewitness of Jesus' death. Not only of his death, but also of his burial and his resurrection. And so I'm putting up this slide. I know the writing's fairly small there, but hopefully you can see it. How in each gospel, Mary is seen as being present at the death and somewhere in there, death, burial, empty tomb, and resurrection. But she was a witness to his crucifixion. We're told that she was there at the cross. We are told that she was a witness to his burial, that she, along with the other women, paid attention to where Nicodemus and Joseph laid, which tomb it was that they laid his body. She was a witness. Matthew 28 there tells us how she was a witness to the earthquake and the angel telling her that Jesus was risen, the earthquake that rolled the stone away. She was a witness to the resurrected Jesus himself as she had a conversation with him according to the Gospel of John. Mary was a witness. I think it's significant here to think not only was she a witness in a verbal sense, but the stories of the Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The apostles aren't there. Matthew wasn't there. It doesn't seem that Mark was there. Luke is certainly not there. He comes along much later in Acts. And John was possibly there at the cross. But Mary was there at all of them. And so there are things that are written in the Gospels that probably she had to tell the authors of the Gospels what happened, because they weren't there. And that really brings us to the last point about her, that she functions as an apostle to the apostles. Let me just explain that. The word apostle means messenger. And so Mary, having witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, she is now the first messenger or apostle of the gospel. The good news, not only that Jesus died, but that he is alive, that he defeated death. And so she runs to tell the apostles. And when she does that, she explains to them what Jesus has told her, and that they're to go to Galilee and to meet him up there. Today is Palm Sunday. We heard earlier the reading of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem as the humble king. The crowds that were there on that day, on that Palm Sunday, didn't know what to do with a humble king. And just a few days later, they're shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The disciples that were there with Jesus at the Last Supper didn't know what to do with a Messiah who was crucified. They gathered in an upper room, fearful of the Jewish leaders. But Mary and the women with her, they'd received, we're told, Luke 8 tells us that they had received deliverance from demons. They had received healing by Jesus, and her dedication to Jesus extended beyond Palm Sunday. Her commitment to follow extended beyond the Garden of Gethsemane. It carried her to the foot of the cross. It carried her to the tomb as he's laid in it. It brings her back on the Sunday morning to finish the preparations of his body and the burial of his body. It brings her back even when she discovers the empty tomb. She comes back to it again after telling the disciples, and stands there weeping outside the tomb by herself. Her commitment to Jesus, her desperation to find his body, her desire her determination to honor him, to have him buried respectfully, is really strong. Her faith that he is the Messiah, he is someone whose message and teaching is genuine, who has transformed her life, is exemplary for all of us. And perhaps it's because of all of this commitment that she demonstrates, this love that still is overflowing her heart, and the grief that is expressed. Perhaps it's for these reasons that God allowed her to be the first witness and messenger of the resurrection. This is a Mary that shouldn't be the subject of rumors in the playground of history. This is a Mary that we can use as an example of faithfulness. Having been delivered from the darkness and the pain of her demons, she followed Jesus, followed him around Galilee. But she was more than just a groupie. She was a student. And Jesus allowed her to be a student. He allowed a woman to come and learn from him just as he allowed the men. Jesus accepted her financial support. It wasn't an insult to his masculinity to depend upon her generosity. In Luke chapter 24, verses 7 and 8, we're told that when the angels reminded the women of Jesus' statement that he must be, the Son of Man must be crucified and on the third day rise again, they remembered his words. They remembered his words because they'd been following him. They'd been paying attention. They'd heard him make that statement. And when the angel says it, they're like, aha, yes, that's what has happened. Now it makes sense. And so that was part of the message, that they hurried off to tell the apostles, not only to tell them that the tomb was empty and that they'd seen an angel and that the angel had said this, but to explain how it was that Jesus' teaching had been fulfilled on this Easter morning. Mary Magdalene is never described as a prophet, but she is certainly a messenger of God, a messenger of good news, carrying the greatest message the world has ever known, that Jesus is alive. And so on Palm Sunday, as we consider what happens before Jesus' death, I think we're challenged to consider our faith, to consider the determination or the depth of our faith. Is our commitment to Jesus best represented by the crowds that are shouting and singing and rejoicing and happy and having a wonderful time on the road into Jerusalem as Jesus rides on the donkey? But then the crowds that disappear on the Monday and only show up again at his trial? Or is our faith, our commitment to follow Jesus best represented by the apostles who said, we're going to stick with you, we're not going to let you down, we're close to you, we're going to sit around a table with you and have a meal, we're going to serve you. But then when life got really dangerous, really difficult, they went and they hid? Or is our faith represented by Mary Magdalene, the woman who, because she'd been delivered from so much, she loved so much, and her love and her faith and her commitment carried her through the doubts, the questions that people had in the crowd on Sunday. It carried her through the fears that the apostles had in the garden on Thursday, and it carried her past the cross on Friday. It carried her to the resurrection, to the empty tomb on the Sunday, and it was there that her faith was rewarded as she received the gift of life, of witnessing the life, the new life that Jesus had, and the hope that comes with it. I believe that our faith, likewise, when it persists, when it endures, when it gets through those difficulties, that we see Jesus also, that he rewards us with hope of a new life, a better life that only he can give. Mary Magdalene, like so many of the women that we've seen throughout Scripture, is an example to us of faith.
Bye.